This panel is a very good logical extension of the previous panel in that we already heard that the government that we thought legacy understanding was clunky, inefficient, slow. Not the word that would come to my mind would be innovation would not be the word coming to the mind, but it has been changing over the past, I want to say, a decade. There was no GovTech space before. Really, some of the people on this stage started thinking, wait a minute, the economy is changing, the consumer behavior is changing, the demographics is changing. So to accommodate that, for the government to work in this 21st century, the government needs to change from the inside out, but it's too big to fail. So it has to change from the outside in. And these three gentlemen here, I want to start off with Ron. Many, many years ago, when most of his VC friends thought he was quote unquote crazy to work and fund startups, to work with the federal government, with the state and the local government, he started GovTech Fund, which is attracting all of his VC friends to come to his door now. So, and by the way, apart from running a very successful VC firm, he also started a school in San Francisco with around 300 children. This man does not sleep. Next we have Jay. Jay Nath is the CIO, Entrepreneur in Residence for the City of San Francisco. When we say he's a EIR for City of San Francisco, he doesn't just stop there. He goes and helps West Oakland and a couple of other cities, including San Leandro. And he's been curating the startups from the GovTech space to work with his cities and cities that he's been touching within the San Francisco Bay Area. And we have Andrew here from Decode 42. Andrew has a background from 18F, which is a federal government White House-funded startup agency that curates startups to bring into the government space. And he has started this San Francisco office to help really get the startups, the GovTech startups, and curate them and incubate them and give them enough guidance to actually work with the federal government. Welcome, gentlemen. Happy to be on the stage with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So my first question would be, we have understood that there's a huge market. The government needs services. The government needs new types of services from the new and emerging technologies or new ways of doing business with its citizens, its customers. So how can we, the three of you and the work that the three of you do, how can we help the startups? How can we curate, in your case, Jay, incubate, in your case, Andrew, and fund and funnel them to a partnership with the U.S. government? This is an open question. Maybe Ron, if you can start.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So I think the first thing that needs to happen, I think, and you heard already a little bit about this morning, is that the government agencies recognize that they have an issue.
Yeah.
And when and that's not trivial to say, because for decades, things were done a certain way. And I think that level of frustration across agencies, local, state, and federal, has now hit a peak where government agencies are just saying, we can't do things the old way. And what I mean by the old way is sort of legacy vendors. You heard it this morning, huge projects, multi-year development cycles, waterfall, all these sort of legacy ideas. They can't afford that. It's not working for them. The systems are not flexible enough, are difficult to maintain. And so there's an understanding now that there's a need for change, and in the context of what people in government see, frankly, in their own lives, in their consumer lives. You know, if they have an iPhone in their hand and they can do all these amazing things, but the systems at work look like they're from the 1980s or not, it just doesn't gel anymore. So that conflict, I think, has risen to a point where, the dissonance, I should say, has risen to a point where now they're saying, we want better solutions and we want innovation. And so that's important as a first step. And then the question is, how do you connect with the innovation? And these gentlemen are going to speak about different ways, but on our side, so I run a venture fund that invests in startups. Our bias, of course, is that we believe innovation happens in startups. And so we're looking for startups that can deliver innovation to government at scale. And so the companies that we're investing in You heard a lot today about government services and contracting. None of our companies do that. They build products. So think about our companies as sort of, if you know Salesforce.com, of course. So think about those kinds of products in the cloud, government agencies buying subscriptions to those products, and scaling those products across agencies. So at a high level, just as a stat, our 13 companies today are connected to about 20,000 agencies. We're adding about 10 a day as a group, and the average sales cycle is something like 76 days. So that doesn't sound sort of normal for government, but that's kind of what's happening. And I'll just leave it at that before turning to my colleagues. But the other thing is that we've heard a lot today about the federal level, and that is fantastic. There's some amazing initiatives that you heard about even this morning at the federal level. The reality that we see on the ground is that a lot of innovation is actually happening at the local level for many reasons we can talk about. But most of the agencies that our companies are working with are at the local level. And just in the last year, we've seen a lot of the same trends around that innovation I talked about, starting at the county and state level, really at scale. And so that's what we're starting to look at investing now.
You know, just to add to that, I think there's this growing recognition that we need to do things differently. And as you see the workforce changing and millennials coming into government, I think there's a recognition and a growing awareness that we need to bring new technologies and tools into the environment, and the old ways of doing things need to change. And so you're seeing sort of the old guard and the new guard having this interesting conversation about agile development, user-centered design, products and services that are much more quick to give value and sort of modular. And there's this sort of learning that's happening, and it's happening culturally, and it's becoming a movement. And on the flip side, on the entrepreneur side, I think you're seeing a growing recognition that this is a real market. There's a huge amount of opportunity, and that there's governments, including our city and many other cities across the US and globally, that are saying, hey, we're going to invest in startups. We see the power of entrepreneurs helping us modernize government. And so I think we're still at the early stages, but I think this is becoming a virtuous cycle where you see successes happening and people picking up on that, saying, hey, I want to be able to get that value as well so rapidly. So instead of these year-long cycles of failed IT implementations, you're seeing them rapidly happening now where value is being delivered in literally weeks or months. And so I think a shift is happening. And we're really excited about being part of that process. I'll speak a little bit later on about a program that we have that accelerates sort of a procurement pipeline for startups and delivers value for cities across the US.
So from Decode 42's perspective, we really see it as a matching problem in many ways. And so, our focus isn't necessarily specifically on GovTech. We think about all enterprise product companies as kind of ready for the government market. And what we see is that federal agencies, and we focus mainly on federal, though the state and local is definitely an interesting area and an area where a lot of innovation and kind of rapid testing around procurement and other things can happen for sure. So what we try to do is educate our companies in a 3-month period on really how to go to market in the federal government, and teach a lot of the things that are either unique, that are a black box from a company looking in from the outside, so that they can actually go and sell in the appropriate way. We also help them segment the market in the right way. So there's a lot of discussion about the size of this market, and the size of this market is real. But if you are a company that is selling a big data platform, the dollar level that you're going to sell into is much smaller than the 40 billion or the 80 billion in the total federal government. And so you have to think about who in the federal government is actually buying the thing that you're selling, the product or the service, and we help our companies do that as well. In addition, we find that the federal government doesn't necessarily have the educated buyers that the private sector has. Or there is a group of educated buyers, but they don't buy for the rest of the organization. And that's, in my opinion, kind of one of the bigger challenges at this point in time, is that agencies need to realize that a few people can make determinations around what the right product is for a certain problem set or a certain area, and they can help the rest of the agency solve for that problem. It doesn't have to be everyone making their own individual decision. So we're hoping that over time, with enough companies, we'll start to kind of create dents in this big ship and steer it in the right direction.
Thank you, gentlemen. This question is specifically for Jay, and there are a lot of members in the audience and in attendance in the TiEcon this weekend. And what does the role of an EIR look like? How do you set one up within a city? San Francisco is doing so very successfully, so as a few other cities across the U.S. and across the world. How do you set up the government up for success so the tech startups, whether they are government related or not, that can sell to the government are able to then make a connection to at the city level, at the state level, federal level, and how do you curate them? And how can our audience take some takeaways from this?
Sure, so I'll jump in and talk about our program, our flagship program called Startup in Residence. And it's a really simple idea. When you think about startups and the impact that they've made in so many other industries, it's surprising that they haven't actually done much in the public sector. And when you think about the fact that it's a $400 billion market, there's been numbers of $1 trillion globally, annually, clearly a huge economic opportunity for entrepreneurs. But at the same time, you also have the ability to make tremendous impact, right? Government is sort of at the intersection of many sort of large challenges in society, whether it's around housing, mobility, public safety, a number of areas. And so when you think about those two things, they're really interesting for entrepreneurs. I think what they're missing are some of the things that Andrew has mentioned, and we're trying to solve for that. So we created a program where we share our needs that have yet to be met by the marketplace. So we search for problems within government, and we scope them out, and then we put them out there for startups to respond to, and they apply, and we match them with those departments. And we do that in a very efficient and effective way. We actually do an RFP that takes about an hour for startups to respond to, about a week for our government folks to create. And so that's, for any of you who know about government procurement, that's warp speed. And after they've been selected, they then go through a 16-week collaboration period where they actually build a whole new product or they get product market fit. And at the end of that, they're able to now go into negotiations and commercialize that product. And for us, we see that contract as sort of our key metric. It demonstrates that there was value created in those 16 weeks and that that they're willing to invest in that value, the government side. And so our conversion rate is about 80%. We have about 20 contracts that have been fulfilled through this program. And we've grown this program not just in San Francisco, but regionally, and we're looking to go even more broadly. So Amsterdam has replicated the program, The Hague, we have replicated the program in Canada. So there's a number of cities globally and nationally that have taken this program and sort of contextualized it for their organization. So we're really excited about that growth and how we're actually innovating around procurement. That's a huge barrier. And so all of the cities that we work with now have adopted this new procurement approach that we call the RFP bus. I'll share one example with you. A company named Binti, a young woman, she's in her 20s, and she was hesitant to be part of this program. She said, this is a big risk for me. I'm not sure, I'm a small company. And I convinced her to join, and she is now our biggest fan. So she helps streamline the foster care process. It's a heavily paper-driven process. It takes background checks, site visits at the home to make sure the home's secure, et cetera. And she automated that process 95%. So it saves governments 40-50% of their administrative time, and they can use that now to actually recruit more families. She started, and she's now got 60% of the California market. She has 18 contracts in less than 6 months. And so we think that, if you're actually solving a problem and we're giving them a platform to be able to commercialize those solutions, they can get rapid growth. And so we help them do that as well. We give them platforms to share the work that they're doing. We're obviously a great reference when other counties and cities call us. And so we're really trying to drive sustainability for these folks as well. So we're starting to see a big part of that change happening. We also tackle the education side. So we have a partnership with NASDAQ to provide education. We've had, I think both of you speak to our entrepreneurs about how do you sell to government? What is an RFP? What is open data? How do you navigate this approach? Who's your economic buyer? And on the flip side, we actually educate government staff. And so that they understand what lean startup is and they can apply that in their workplace. They understand the vocabulary and the methodology of entrepreneurs, and we're trying to create entrepreneurs in government as well. And so we're starting a small movement within government who recognizes that there's a tremendous amount of value in entrepreneurship and that it can truly transform government.
I'm going to add, I think this is, both what Ron and Jay are doing is really interesting because it's market making in many ways. The lack of investment or the lack of interest on the part of the government, there was a rational reason for that, like a rational economic reason. In Jay's case, he's in many ways, the program is de-risking for, city employees, and this could be replicated at the state and the federal level as well. De-risking, not going to the incumbent vendor, going to a smaller company that, may not have a proven track record of working with large agencies at any level of government. The other interesting thing is that, when the market is actually accessible in a shorter period of time, you don't have to have individuals like Ron, who's out ahead of the rest of the investment community on this, saying I'm going to do this and I'm going to prove that it works. But by stepping out, you are in many ways creating a market for those companies and the entrepreneurs to say, I'm not going to go and create a mobile game. I'm going to go and build a tool for the foster care system, which is incredible. And you see a lot of entrepreneurs starting to head in that direction instead of going into the social media or consumer space. Both are all well and good. The impact that you can have at the government level is really, really fantastic.
Thank you. It's pretty evident from all the conversation that we've had that it's a three-party system here. There's the startup ecosystem on this one end, then there's the government, and people who understand the tech startup ecosystem and the government and have the intuition and the knowledge and the experience to say this works. The business case is not really here. It's a fantastic product, but there is no business case. So that brings up the question for you, Ron. How do you assess when a tech startup is a good fit, has a good market fit, has a good business use case fit, or a government use case fit in this situation? And considering all the life cycle of implementation, whether the go-to-market. So how do you make a decision, especially given you're in a very unique situation compared to a lot of other VCs where it's not just the funding that your VC provides, it's also the knowledge that you personally bring to the table with working with the government for so long. So what's the success criteria for you? How do those 13 or the 15 that you're going to have make it to the 15 on your list?
So some of my answer will sound a little bit generic, and some will be specific to GovTech. So, as a venture investor, my capital is probably the most expensive there is out there. So the kinds of companies that we are investing in have to meet certain financial and sort of growth metrics to justify the capital. And for us, that looks like we have a number of companies now growing double digits a month, so 50 to 80% quarterly or quarter-over-quarter growth. So the way that we look at it is that the number one answer is you have to have built a product that solves an absolute hair-on-fire burning pain point. So all of our companies go through 3 steps. The first, in their sort of company and product evolution, the first thing that they're doing is they're solving a critical workflow. So the workflow that they're working on is mission critical to the agency. They'll map it out, 67 steps, and they'll identify the 8 steps that are just absolutely high value, high frequency, and just archaic in the way that they were being done. So they feel like they can really improve that. So we are an investor in Binti, which Jay talked about, and the process in adoptions, and I can talk about law enforcement and procurement and on, just astounding in terms of the opportunity for fixing a lot of those workflows. And then the next step is the question is whether if you do that and you do it well, there's a demand for that because it's the number one priority for the buyer. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing is, can you take all that and assemble all the data that comes from that workflow And that's a really big challenge for a lot of startups because, as it turns out, data in government, and I'm sure Jay can attest to this as well, and Andrew as well from his experience, it's in a lot of silos. And so how do you stitch all that data together? How do you build value there? And if you can do that, solve a workflow and and help curate and normalize the data, then you can really then go on to build even more sort of next level, higher order products. So that's sort of a framework that we think about. And as a small fund, a seed fund, we're looking for companies that frankly have 5, 6 agencies, even as beta customers. Maybe they've gone through the STIR program. We're too small to invest in just ideas. We'd like to get there at some point, but for now that's where we are. And as I mentioned earlier, we're connected to thousands of agencies. So our diligence is pretty straightforward. We can call the agencies and say, what do you think? And then lastly, we have now 13 companies, so many of our CEOs are actually investing in the other companies. So that's a huge validation point if one of your own CEOs and colleagues wants to invest in your company. So that's a little bit of how we think about the framework.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's say there's a startup that Ron approved of and got on his list, or someone like Ron approved of, got on his list. And then there is a real need within a government ecosystem like Jay's that has an entrepreneur in residence, startup in residence type of program, or maybe not. So how do you, Andrew, and your company and companies like yours, accelerators, incubators, take these companies that there is a market fit for and groom them for a full-on partnerships? Because this space is very infamous for a lot of barriers to entry and perceived barriers to entry. And I think, in my experience, perceived barriers to entry are more than there are real barriers. So how do you and your firm address this concern?
So one area where we've kind of focused is one starting off, kind of starting small. So we kind of work in categories. Our last cohort, which just finished a few weeks ago, was around big data and analytics. And that allows us to, one, identify companies a little bit more easily, and two, go and find the right agency partners. In the last 2 panels ago, there was a great comment about finding the right person in the company that has the ability to say yes to something and then has money behind it to bring money to that yes. We find that if we were to bring together a cohort that was a disparate group of companies doing things in a lot of different areas around enterprise, it would be much harder to find the right customers at each agency where that's relevant. We know who the individuals are at the federal agencies thinking about big data problems. It's the science agencies, it's the chief data officers, it's always DoD, it's the intelligence community. And so that allows us to target our, really business development for our companies in a much easier way. There are perceived barriers and there are real barriers. Real barriers for me are things like the sales cycle. Real barriers are things like the security compliance process inside of the federal government. So, that costing a lot of money from an engineering standpoint for a company that is at a smaller scale is a difficult thing to swallow. And it's why a lot of companies say no to the federal government or state and local governments in the first place. And so what we try to do is help the company get educated on all of those things so that they can make a better cost per dollar revenue calculation. And if they have to say no at the point in time when we think it's right, and they're making that decision from a business standpoint, we're okay with that. But they may have a better calculation there and they may be able to go to market more rapidly because of that. But that's really how we operate in many ways. So we have a class right now that's around artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we worked really hard up front to know who in the federal government is thinking about that space.
And I'll just say that, what's really interesting is when you think about sort of the growth stage of startups, federal government is, obviously the deal sizes are much bigger, but the actual length, the due diligence, the time to actually close that deal is much longer. And so if you're an early stage company like Binti, you're going to work with smaller municipalities. And so San Francisco is fairly big where I work, but we wanted to prove that entrepreneurship works in any context because everyone says, oh yeah, San Francisco, that makes a lot of sense. we worked intentionally with a small city in the East Bay called San Leandro, an even smaller community near Sacramento called West Sacramento, I think 30,000 people. And they were able to drive so much value by partnering with startups. And so those cities can work more nimbly. They get showcased in front of their city councils, which they wouldn't be able to do in San Francisco. That just doesn't happen in San Francisco. And so you see this sort of spectrum within local government, and then you can sort of graduate to state and federal. So there's this nice sort of evolution of being able to go up the value chain into bigger deal sizes.
And this is an important point because, the incentive structure in government is set up as, when you're an employee, to not take a huge amount of risk when buying something. You are not incentivized either through bonus or whatever it might be to go out and find the next great thing and go buy that to solve a difficult problem. And the demonstration of success that Jay just described, and if you are, starting a company or have a company that's looking to do work with the government, being able to show, we worked in this locality, where we worked with this county, we worked with this state, we worked with this federal agency, and we produced this outcome, which is better than the other outcome that was being produced before. That is a real driver of adoption across multiple entities in the government, and so keep that in your back pocket. Make sure that you jot down when you've had that successful moment with an agency, whether it's dollar savings or improved outcomes, and show that time and again, because that really resonates with buyers in the government space.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think before I was involved with the GovTech Fund and government, I was in private industry. I've actually never seen an industry that I've been part of that talks as much amongst themselves as government agencies. They really talk, and they know each other. And whether you're local, state, and federal, they sort of, at one level, feel like they're on the same team. That's different than pick any other industry you can think of. So this idea that Andrew's referring to is critical. If you are successful, that's going to go a long way for you. And if you're not, that's not going to help you either. So that's one point. I've just observed that. And secondly, I think, I actually think that is what's sort of accelerating this innovation and change, maybe faster now in this industry than maybe others, because there is a lot of sharing going on. There is a lot of re-educating. And so I think even the procurement cycle stuff that we're seeing at the local, we're now seeing that shifting at the state level. I think over time you will see improvements at the federal level. There's a lot of cross-learning and dialogue that's going on that I think is unique and really exciting, actually. I don't think it would have been feasible for startups and innovation and programs like this to move in a context that didn't have that kind of sharing.
Yeah, and at the federal level, there are pockets of successful pilots that are trying to run procurements in the timeframes that Jay described. DHS is their Science and Technology Directorate. They, for example, are doing procurement in what I would call the right way. So, a great example, an easy example to think about is they went out and said, hey, if you're building a product that is a wearable for a working dog, we want to talk to you because we are interested in that space. And there are, if you are that company, you are that company, you can go talk to DHS about it. And they're letting contracts, not huge contracts, but six-figure contracts for those companies if they can prove that in order to prove that they work in the kind of the environment that DHS works in. The issue that the federal government needs to solve for now is how do you take that pilot program and turn it into something that is widely adopted across the federal government and doesn't just let six-figure contracts, but the 7, 8, 9-figure contracts that happen in the federal government on a day-to-day basis. So that's the problem that we're dealing with, or the federal government is dealing with right now, and it'll be great to see kind of movement in this space in many ways.
Really interesting conversations, you guys. I wish I could talk for a couple more hours. I could talk to you for a couple more hours, as you guys know. But I've got to call it a day. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've learned that there is a lot of money, and then you can land and expand, and there is a pie for all of us. So I hope you guys enjoy the rest of TiE. I know I will. And thank you so much, gentlemen, for being a part of this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.